Meet somebody. Did you ever walk into a building, you work in a building like people say work at NBC, and you see the person the first time?
Johnny Carson's couch wasn't just a chair. It was where careers exploded overnight. For 30 years, one laugh from Johnny could turn an unknown comic into a legend. Some guests didn't just make him smile, they made him lose control completely, gasping, wiping tears, forgetting he was live on national television. Tonight we count down 10 performers who broke Johnny Carson on camera. Insults he couldn't dodge. Jokes he never saw coming. Moments so unscripted the crew stopped everything just to watch. This is the list every comedy fan still argues about. Stick around for number 1, because even Carson admitted no one else ever made him laugh like that. George Carlin didn't just visit Johnny Carson's show. He practically lived there. 105 appearances between 1967 and 1992, a number no other guest ever came close to touching. He wasn't only a comedian who showed up to perform. When Carson needed a break, Carlin was the guy trusted to sit in that chair and run the whole show himself. His early years on the couch looked almost ordinary, clean jokes, safe topics, nothing that hinted at what was coming. Then the 70s happened, and Carlin transformed into something television had never fully allowed before. He became the voice pushing every boundary networks tried to protect, most famously with his routine about the 7 words you could never say on air. He never actually said them on Carson's show. He didn't need to. Just mentioning that they existed, that everyone in the room already knew them, was enough to make the audience erupt. Carson respected that edge more than people realized. He let Carlin push right up to the line, sometimes laughing at jokes riskier than anything else on his show that night. There was a mutual trust there, the kind you only build after appearing together for over 2 decades straight. One night in May of 1981 became the stuff of television legend. Carson brought out not one but 2 of the sharpest minds in comedy at the same time, George Carlin and Richard Pryor, sharing the stage together. Watching 2 legends read each other, adjust, and build off one another's energy in real time was something audiences had never seen before and would rarely see again. 11 years later, just 1 week before Carson's own retirement, Carlin walked out for his 105th and final appearance. This time there was no nervous energy, no hoping for an invitation back. Carlin said it himself, this was the first time doing the show without any pressure of wondering if he'd ever return. Carson called him one of his favorite guys, a phrase he didn't hand out easily after 30 years of guests. Carlin kept performing, kept pushing, kept refusing to soften his voice, all the way until he passed in 2008. But it was those Tonight Show years that built the foundation, the platform, the trust, that let a kid from clean stand-up become one of the most fearless voices comedy has ever produced. Carson didn't just give him airtime. He gave him room to become dangerous, and comedy has never been the same since.
Here's Jay Leno.
Jay Leno. March of 1977. That's when Jay Leno first walked onto Johnny Carson's stage, and something clicked instantly. No slow build, no awkward first impression. The audience connected with him from the very first joke, and so did Johnny. What made Leno different was his style. He wasn't chasing shock value or pushing boundaries like some of Carson's other favorites. He built his comedy from something simpler, everyday observations everyone in that room had already noticed but never heard turned into a punchline. The weather, the news, ordinary frustrations, all filtered through that lopsided grin that somehow made even average material land like gold. Carson kept inviting him back, and by 1987 something bigger started happening. Whenever Johnny needed time off, Leno became the man trusted to fill that chair. Not a random guest host, the guest host. And everyone at NBC quietly understood what that meant for the future. Behind the scenes though, it wasn't simple. David Letterman wanted that seat too, and for a while nobody knew who would get it. The whole thing spilled into headlines, played out across newspapers and television specials, turning a private decision into a public battle everyone was watching. In the end, NBC made its choice. Starting in May of 1992, Jay Leno would become the new face of The Tonight Show. Carson gave him one final on-air moment before stepping away completely. They sat together, joked about how far Leno had come since that very first appearance a decade earlier, and Clint Eastwood joined them that night too, a subtle signal of just how much weight this handoff carried. Then came May 25, 1992. Leno's first night as host. 22 million people tuned in to watch. He would go on to host that chair for nearly 2 decades, step away once, return briefly during a chaotic network shuffle, then leave again in 2014. Today he stepped back from nightly hosting, but he never actually stopped performing. He still tours as a stand-up, still finds those same everyday observations, still gets that same laugh he first pulled out of Johnny Carson back in 1977, the laugh that eventually handed him one of the biggest chairs in television history.
Don Rickles.
Don Rickles. Some guests made Johnny Carson laugh. Don Rickles made him afraid to laugh, because he never knew who was getting insulted next, and there was always a chance it might be him. Rickles earned a reputation unlike anyone else who ever sat on that couch. He didn't tell jokes in the traditional sense. He attacked, rapid fire, aiming at everyone in the room, the crew, the audience, even Carson himself, and somehow it always landed as pure affection wrapped inside chaos. He said it best himself once, joking that his biggest fear was that somewhere out there sat one single person in the audience he hadn't managed to offend yet. Carson understood exactly what the act was. He knew none of it came from real anger, that Rickles genuinely had nothing against the people he tore apart on stage, it was simply the performance. But knowing that never stopped him from losing control, laughing every single time. One night in February of 1968 became the moment nobody who saw it ever forgot. Carson had dressed up in a Speedo for a ridiculous massage bit when Rickles suddenly burst onto the set completely unannounced, uninvited, unscripted. The entire crew broke. Carson himself could barely function through the laughter. It wasn't planned comedy anymore, it was pure chaos unfolding live in front of millions of people. Then in 1976, Carson decided to get him back. He stormed out of his own studio mid-show, marched next door, and confronted Rickles directly about breaking a cigarette box on his desk, a bit so spontaneous and strange it felt like anything could happen next, and that unpredictability was exactly the appeal. Across dozens of appearances, that same electric, dangerous energy never faded. Carson respected the sheer nerve it took to say absolutely anything to anyone without flinching, and that kind of fearless chemistry simply couldn't be written into a script no matter how hard anyone tried. Fans still call him the greatest guest in the history of late-night television, and after watching what he pulled off decade after decade with Johnny Carson, it's nearly impossible to make a serious case against it.
Robin Williams.
Robin Williams. Robin Williams didn't perform on Johnny Carson's show. He detonated on it. He started appearing in 1981, right as Mork and Mindy had turned him into one of the biggest names on television. Over the next decade he came back 9 times, and every single appearance felt like nobody, including Carson, knew exactly what was about to happen next. His mind moved faster than the cameras could follow, jumping between characters, voices, and completely improvised tangents at a speed that felt almost impossible to keep up with. One night in 1986 became legendary because Williams abandoned any script entirely. He slipped between characters mid-sentence, invented bits on the spot, and moved so fast that Carson lost control, laughing multiple times, unable to hold his composure no matter how hard he tried. Johnny once described him as a whirlwind on that stage, and even that description barely captured what actually happened when the cameras rolled. Then came May 21, 1992, Carson's second-to-last episode ever. Williams walked out alongside Bette Midler, and what unfolded became one of the most talked-about nights in the show's entire history. Carson introduced him simply as a dear friend, and from there Williams unleashed rapid-fire jokes that wove perfectly into Midler's performance, sending the entire audience into a frenzy. Midler herself would later win an Emmy for that very episode. What made Williams so unforgettable wasn't just the speed or the chaos. It was the contrast. Carson's humor was measured, controlled, built on perfect timing. Williams was the opposite, a storm of energy that Carson could never fully predict, and that unpredictability created some of the most electric television moments of the entire era. He passed away in 2014, but those Carson appearances still circulate constantly today, rediscovered by new audiences who stumble onto that same manic energy for the first time and understand immediately why he left such a permanent mark on comedy history. Eddie Murphy. 21 years old, and Eddie Murphy already looked unstoppable the moment he stepped onto Johnny Carson's stage. He appeared 3 times in 1982 alone, right as his career was about to explode. Saturday Night Live had already made him a name, and 48 Hours was about to turn him into a movie star, but before any of that fully landed, Carson gave him a national stage to show exactly what he could do. His comedy carried an edge most young comics wouldn't dare bring to network television. One performance in February became something people still talk about, a routine so bold, so risky for its time, that the crowd sat completely locked in from the first line to the last. He joked about the idea of a black president years before it felt like a realistic possibility, turning something politically loaded into something the entire room couldn't stop laughing at. Carson didn't just tolerate that risk. He respected it. He welcomed Murphy with the kind of warmth usually reserved for performers Carson recognized as once-in-a-generation talents, the ones you could tell instantly weren't going to stay unknown for long. By July of that same year, Murphy walked away from The Tonight Show stage for the final time, right before leaving Saturday Night Live behind completely to chase something even bigger in Hollywood. Comedy Central would later rank him among the 100 greatest stand-up comedians of all time, and those early Carson appearances are a huge part of why that legacy exists. Today Murphy stands as one of the most recognizable faces in film history, but those 3 nights on Carson's couch captured something raw that never fully returned once superstardom arrived. A young comic, barely old enough to legally drink, making one of the most seasoned hosts in television history laugh with nothing but pure, undeniable talent and the confidence to say things nobody else was brave enough to say yet.
What's the problem?
You know, I'm an author, usually authors get the...
Steve Martin didn't just appear on Johnny Carson's show. He grew up on it, right in front of the entire country. His first appearance came in 1972, and he kept coming back for the next 2 decades, all the way until the show ended in 1992. Carson watched the whole transformation happen in real time, a stand-up comedian slowly turning into one of the biggest movie stars in America, and he had the best seat in the house for every single step of it. What made Martin different was how physical his comedy felt. He wasn't just telling jokes, he was performing them with his entire body. Balloon animals twisted mid-sentence, banjo tunes dropped into the middle of a bit, perfectly timed pratfalls that looked accidental but never were. During the peak of his wild and crazy guy era, his Tonight Show spots turned into must-watch television, the kind of appearances people plan their night around. Then came May 6, 1992, just weeks before Carson stepped away from the show forever. Martin walked out and performed what became known as the Great Fly Magic Routine, an entire bit built around stunts happening through his own zipper. It sounds absurd written down, and it was, but it landed as one of the most memorable moments in the show's final stretch, the kind of bit people still bring up decades later without needing to explain the whole context. Carson clearly saw something in him beyond just a funny guest. He'd often push Martin to try something unexpected, something a little riskier than the last time, and that playful trust between them showed up in every single appearance. Martin eventually moved into film with roles like The Jerk, then reinvented himself again as a respected novelist and musician. He's still considered one of the most beloved names in comedy today, but those Carson years captured him at his most fearless, a performer still figuring out exactly how far he could push a joke, with Johnny right there laughing the entire way through.
Seinfeld.
Jerry Seinfeld. May 6, 1981. A 26-year-old Jerry Seinfeld walked onto Johnny Carson's stage for the very first time, and that single appearance ended up changing the entire direction of his career. Carson was impressed enough that he asked him to come back almost immediately, a rare move that signaled something bigger was happening. And it was. Seinfeld himself later admitted that hearing Carson simply ask, "Will you have me back on?" gave him a level of confidence he desperately needed at that exact point in his career. What's remarkable is the timing. Every one of Seinfeld's early appearances happened before his sitcom had even aired, before most of the country had any idea who he was. Carson wasn't reacting to an already famous name. He was betting purely on raw talent, on a young comic from New York with sharp, low-key observational humor that never once relied on shock value or profanity to land a laugh. That style is exactly what Carson appreciated most. The clever wordplay, the way Seinfeld could find something absurd hiding inside completely normal, everyday moments everyone had experienced but never actually noticed. Over the course of the decade, Seinfeld returned to that stage at least half a dozen more times, becoming one of those dependable guests who could make an audience think while they were still laughing. By 1989, just 2 years after his first Carson appearance, Seinfeld had his own sitcom running on NBC, one that would eventually become the network's biggest show. Today he remains active in comedy, still touring, still releasing specials, still sharp as ever. But he's never let go of where it actually started. Long before the sitcom, before the fame, before his name became synonymous with television comedy itself, there was one 26-year-old comic given a shot on national television by a host who saw something worth betting on, and that single bet changed everything that came after it.
No, Burt Reynolds.
Burt Reynolds. 61 appearances. That's how many times Burt Reynolds walked onto Johnny Carson's stage, and somehow every single one turned into something unforgettable. He wasn't a stand-up comedian. He was an action star, a leading man, someone you'd expect to sit stiffly through an interview and leave. Instead, Reynolds and Carson built one of the most natural on-screen chemistries in the show's entire history, full of chaos, genuine laughter, and moments nobody could have possibly scripted in advance. The most famous moment happened during what started as a completely normal interview. Reynolds casually reached over and poured whipped cream straight down Carson's lap, and the entire studio lost it instantly. Both men couldn't stop laughing, the audience ate up every second of it, and one later broadcast summed it up perfectly by asking who else could get away with spraying whipped cream down Johnny's pants. That was the pattern with Reynolds. He never showed up expecting a straightforward conversation. He came ready for elaborate bits, pranks, and physical comedy, and Carson clearly loved playing the calm, composed straight man against Reynolds' roguish, unpredictable charm. Footage from a 1974 photo shoot together captures exactly how comfortable they were around each other, two men who trusted each other completely on camera. Reynolds later described Carson simply as the funniest guy he knew, no exaggeration, no hesitation. Then on March 12, 1992, just weeks before Carson's own retirement, Reynolds returned one final time for what would become his last ever appearance on that couch. Reynolds passed away in 2018, but those Tonight Show moments are still remembered as some of the clearest examples of exactly what made him so charming on camera. Not the action films, not the leading man roles, but 61 nights of pure chemistry with a host who somehow always ended up wearing the consequences of it.
Successful show on NBC for a decade. Would you welcome Mr. David Letterman?
David Letterman. November 24, 1978. That's the night David Letterman first walked onto Johnny Carson's stage, and Carson recognized something different in him almost immediately. Letterman didn't sound like anyone else who'd sat on that couch before. His humor was dry, sarcastic, almost self-aware in a way that felt completely different from Carson's warmer, gentler approach. Over the next several years he kept coming back, each time leaning further into that same deadpan, behind-the-scenes style that made him stand out from every other guest. Carson noticed that difference more than people realized at the time. Quietly, he started thinking of Letterman as a possible successor, someone who understood the format well enough to eventually carry it forward himself. Behind the scenes, Letterman had actually been working on staff, writing monologues, and he never hid the fact that hosting was exactly what he wanted eventually. So when NBC made its choice and picked Jay Leno instead, Letterman didn't pretend it didn't sting. He joked openly about still not being over it, and knowing the years of tension that led up to that decision, it's hard to believe he was fully joking. Despite that, the relationship between him and Carson stayed genuinely warm underneath the competitive edge. On May 15, 1992, during Carson's final weeks on air, Johnny brought Letterman back one more time, alongside Clint Eastwood and Bob Hope, a lineup that made it clear exactly how much respect Carson still held for him regardless of how the succession had played out. Letterman's own career exploded from there. Late Night became his home from 1982 through 1993, then The Late Show carried him all the way to 2015, when he finally stepped away from hosting for good. Today he lives quietly, away from the spotlight he once fought so hard to inherit. But those early Carson appearances are where it all started, a young writer with a strange, sharp sense of humor that Johnny spotted years before the rest of television caught up, with that would go on to define an entire generation of late night. Rodney Dangerfield. April of 1969 almost never happened. Before Rodney Dangerfield ever stepped foot on Johnny Carson's stage, he sent a letter accusing one of the show's writers of stealing his jokes. Not exactly the start you'd expect for one of the most beloved guest relationships in the show's history. Somehow they worked it out, and on April 14, 1969, Dangerfield made his first appearance. It was an instant hit. He won over Carson and the entire audience in one single night, and from that moment on he wasn't just a guest anymore, he became a regular fixture on that couch. What made him different was the delivery. Dangerfield built his entire act around one simple idea, that he got no respect from anyone, ever, and he sold that premise with a limping walk onto stage and a dead serious face while describing one disaster after another. Carson could never fully hold it together watching him work, often losing composure completely as Dangerfield piled joke after joke about his endless misfortune. By 1980, Dangerfield had hit his absolute peak. Caddyshack had just hit theaters, and his comedy album No Respect had already won a Grammy. His material had gotten bolder, sharper, more outrageous than ever, and Carson was constantly reduced to tears trying to keep from laughing during every single appearance. One show from 1979 became a perfect example of exactly why audiences loved him so much. His routine had the entire crowd jumping to their feet, and Carson later admitted, flat out, that no one else in 3 decades of guests ever made him laugh quite the way Rodney did. From 1969 all the way through the 80s, Dangerfield kept coming back, turning into something closer to an institution than a guest. He passed away in 2004, but his signature line, the one about never getting any respect, along with decades of wild anecdotes, created a style of comedy people still quote today, one built entirely around a man who somehow made getting no respect the most respected act in the room.